The Alexander family home was buzzing with excitement. The Christmas season was drawing near, and for the children, that meant the school trip was only a few days away. It was a tradition at the school to take a trip every year before the holiday break, and this year was no different. Olivia, Hope, and Hannah couldn't stop talking about their upcoming adventure. They had packed their bags, written their lists of what to bring, and couldn't wait to get on the bus with their classmates. The air was filled with joy and energy as they discussed what they hoped the trip would be like. "Can't wait for this trip. We're going to have so much fun," Olivia, the youngest at 12, exclaimed as she bounced around the living room. "I'm so excited. I've heard this year's trip will be the best one yet," Hope, who was 14, added. She was always the one who stayed calm and collected, but even she couldn't hide her excitement. "Exercise. I hope they have a lot of games and activities. I want to make new friends," said Hannah, the oldest at 16, as she packed a few more items into her bag. Hannah was the leader of the three, and she made sure everything was in order. Even though she was excited, there was a bit of worry hidden in her eyes, but she didn't want her younger sisters to see it. Mr. Alexander, their father, was sitting in his favorite armchair by the window, smiling at the happy noise around him. He loved the Christmas season. It was always a time when the family felt especially close, and his children were more than ready for their school trip. He was sure that they would return with exciting stories to tell. "You girls are gonna have the best time ever," Mr. Alexander said with a laugh as he looked over the list his daughters had made. "You're all well prepared. I can't imagine you forgetting anything." "I'm worried about them, though," Mrs. Alexander said softly, her voice tinged with concern as she stood in the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had been quietly listening to the children's chatter, but there was a knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. "What if something happens to them? I don't know, Alexander. I just have this bad feeling about this trip." Mr. Alexander turned his head toward his wife, a reassuring smile on his face. "Don't worry, darling. Everything will be fine. They're going to be perfectly safe. You know how well the school plans these trips." Mrs. Alexander wasn't convinced. "I just can't shake it off, Alexander. Something feels wrong, like we should be doing more." Her husband stood up and walked over to her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "We've done everything we can. They've been prayed for, and they'll be in good hands. Trust me, love. Nothing bad will happen to them." Mrs. Alexander nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. She had always been the more cautious one in the family. She worried about everything: her children's safety, the weather, even the food they ate. But Mr. Alexander, the ever-optimistic one, believed everything would work out. He believed that his daughters would come back with happy memories to cherish, and he didn't want his wife's worry to cloud their excitement. "I'll pray for them," Mrs. Alexander said quietly as she turned back to the dishes. "You always do," Mr. Alexander said, his voice filled with warmth. "And that's what matters most." As the evening wore on, the children continued their chatter, eager to leave the next morning for their trip. They didn't notice the tension in the air between their parents. The worry that Mrs. Alexander felt was hidden beneath a calm exterior, but it lingered, and she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, as the family sat down to a simple dinner, the conversation shifted to other things. But in the back of Mrs. Alexander's mind, her concern stayed. She looked at her daughters, smiling and laughing, so full of life and excitement. They were her world, and the thought of anything happening to them made her heart ache. She forced herself to push the worry away, focusing instead on the love she had for them and the hope that her prayers would be enough. After dinner, the girls went to bed early, knowing they had a big day ahead of them. But even as they drifted off to sleep, their dreams were filled with thoughts of the school trip, and they had no idea that the excitement of Christmas would soon be overshadowed by something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the house, Mr. Alexander sat in his chair, staring out the window. His thoughts were filled with his family's future and how proud he was of his children. He whispered a prayer under his breath, hoping for their safety. It was something he did often, quiet prayers spoken only in the stillness of his heart. He believed that God was always with them, guiding them, and that this trip would be no different. But deep down in the silence of the night, even Mr. Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it in his bones. The stillness of the night seemed heavier than usual, and the chill in the air made him pull his coat tighter around him. The family slept soundly that night, unaware of the storm that was coming. The morning would bring the beginning of a journey, but no one could foresee the heartache that would follow. The morning arrived quickly, filled with the usual bustle and excitement of a school trip day. The air outside was crisp, with a hint of the December chill that would soon settle in for the holiday season. Inside the Alexander household, there was no sign of the worry that Mrs. Alexander had carried with her the night before. Instead, the house was full of the sound of zippers being pulled, suitcases being packed, and cheerful voices calling out as the children gathered their things. "Don't forget your gloves, Olivia," Mrs. Alexander called out as her youngest daughter dashed around the house, still trying to find the perfect jacket for the trip. Olivia had a habit of packing and unpacking multiple times before settling on the outfit she would wear. "And make sure you check your bag twice." "I'm ready, Mom," Olivia beamed, throwing her bag over her shoulder. She looked at Hope and Hannah, who were already waiting by the door, their bags neatly packed and ready to go. Hope, the 14-year-old, was always organized, making sure everything was in order before they left. She glanced at her mom, her smile bright, but with a hint of sadness in her eyes. "We'll be fine, Mom," Hope said, trying to reassure her mother. "We're going to have so much fun. Don't worry." Mrs. Alexander smiled, though her heart felt heavy. "I will, I promise," Hope replied. She reached over and gave her mother a quick hug. "We'll be back before you know it." Hannah, who was the most level-headed of the three, checked the clock and said, "We better go or we'll miss the bus." The children quickly filed out the door, waving goodbye to their mom. Mr. Alexander, who had been reading the morning paper, stood up and gave each of them a hug. "Have fun, girls," he said, his voice full of warmth. "We'll be praying for you." The school bus had already pulled up in front of their house when they stepped outside. It was a big white Toyota vehicle, the kind that seemed to promise adventure and excitement. The driver, an older man with graying hair and glasses, waved from the front of the bus. He looked friendly enough, but his eyes seemed tired, as though he hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. "Morning, kids," he greeted them with a smile that seemed forced. "Ready for an adventure?" The girls nodded eagerly, climbing aboard the bus. Olivia found a seat by the window, and Hope and Hannah followed suit, sitting a few rows back. They all chattered excitedly about the trip, planning to have a good time with their friends and enjoy the fun activities that had been promised. The bus filled with laughter and the sound of voices talking over one another as everyone eagerly anticipated what the day would bring. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Mrs. Alexander stood in the doorway watching them go. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and for a moment she stood frozen, watching the bus as it disappeared down the street. The nagging worry in her heart hadn't left her. She knew something wasn't quite right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Still, she forced herself to smile and step back inside the house. Her husband came to stand next to her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "They'll be fine," he reassured her, though he too couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled over him. "Trust me." "I know," Mrs. Alexander whispered, her voice soft. "I just can't stop worrying." "Let's pray," Mr. Alexander said, guiding her to the living room. "We'll pray for their safety. Nothing bad will happen." The bus rattled along the highway, its tires humming a rhythmic tune against the asphalt. The children's laughter and chatter filled the air, a sharp contrast to the heavy, overcast sky that loomed above. The weather seemed undecided, shifting between patches of sunlight and the occasional drizzle that splattered the windows. Olivia pressed her face against the glass, watching the trees zip past. "Look, Hope, that one looks like a giant umbrella," she giggled, pointing at a tree with wide, spreading branches. Hope leaned over to take a look. "You're right. Maybe it's hiding elves underneath," she teased, earning a laugh from Olivia. Hannah, seated by the aisle, glanced at her sisters and smiled faintly. She admired their ability to find joy in the smallest things. Pulling her sweater closer around her shoulders, she turned her attention to the teachers seated near the front. They appeared calm, occasionally looking back to ensure everyone was behaving. The bus driver, however, seemed less composed. His face was set in a tight expression, his brows furrowed as he navigated the twisting road ahead. The once jovial whistling had stopped, replaced by a tense silence. He rubbed his temples briefly before returning both hands to the wheel, his movements a little too rigid. At the back of the bus, some boys had started a rowdy game of "Who can shout louder?" Their booming voices filled the bus, but the driver didn't seem to notice. His focus was elsewhere, on the road, on the rearview mirror, and occasionally on the dashboard, where a blinking light hinted at some mechanical issue. Hannah noticed it. Leaning toward her sisters, she whispered, "Do you think something's wrong with the bus?" Hope shrugged. "I'm sure it's fine. They wouldn't let us go if it wasn't safe." Olivia, oblivious to the conversation, was busy sketching the umbrella-like tree in her notebook, adding tiny elves beneath it. The road ahead began to wind more sharply, the curves growing tighter as the bus climbed a hilly stretch. The children barely noticed, their attention fixed on their games and conversations. But the driver's tension was palpable. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, as he navigated a particularly sharp turn. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, followed by a jarring thud. The bus lurched, and the children screamed as they were thrown against their seats. Hannah grabbed Olivia, holding her tightly, while Hope clutched the armrest, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" a boy shouted from the back. The driver struggled to regain control, his foot slamming on the brakes. The bus skidded, veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. A collective gasp filled the air as the vehicle tilted precariously before slamming back onto all four wheels. "Everyone stay calm," one of the teachers shouted, her voice shaking. "It's going to be okay." But it wasn't okay. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and the engine made a disturbing grinding noise. The driver pulled the bus to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he turned off the ignition. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The children murmured affirmations, though some were crying, and others looked pale with fear. The teachers quickly moved to check on the students, offering soothing words and reassuring pats. Meanwhile, the driver stepped outside to inspect the bus. He crouched by the front tire, his face falling as he saw the shredded rubber and the faint trail of leaking fluid beneath the vehicle. "What's going on?" Hope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hannah shook her head. "I don't know, but something's not right." The driver climbed back into the bus, wiping his hands on a rag. "We've got a flat tire and a busted radiator," he announced grimly. "I'll call for a replacement bus. Everyone, stay seated and stay calm." The children's initial relief was short-lived. The road was deserted, with no sign of help in sight. The teachers did their best to keep spirits high, leading the students in songs and games. But unease hung in the air like a storm cloud. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. The replacement bus was nowhere to be seen, and the cold began to creep in. Hannah wrapped her arms around her sisters, trying to keep them warm. Then, in the distance, the low rumble of an approaching vehicle broke the silence. The children perked up, hope flickering in their eyes. But as the sound grew louder, it wasn't the familiar purr of a school bus engine. It was a deep, guttural roar, accompanied by the heavy clinking of chains. The driver's face turned ashen as a tanker truck appeared around the bend, its headlights blazing. It was moving too fast, its trailer swaying dangerously as it approached the stranded bus. All it took was for John to turn his head so that he would not face the driver's unmistakable proud mane. "Everyone, hold on," the driver shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The world seemed to collapse around Hope as the bus careened off the road, crashing violently into the tanker. The deafening noise of the impact rang in her ears, and for a moment everything was dark. She was thrown from her seat, her body slamming against the side of the bus as it tilted and overturned. There was a sudden explosion of heat, and then the smell of smoke and burning rubber filled the air. Hope's heart raced as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. She was dizzy, struggling to breathe as the air inside the bus became thick with smoke. The sounds of screaming children and the crackling of fire were overwhelming. Panic erupted around her, but Hope could barely process it. She felt the bus shift again, this time tilting further as it rolled to a stop. Her body was battered, and she could feel blood on her skin, but she couldn't focus on the pain. All that mattered was survival, getting out of the bus, away from the flames. The fire was spreading quickly. It wasn't just the bus that was burning. The tanker had exploded, sending flames licking at the surrounding trees and the twisted metal of the wrecked bus. The sound of the fire was deafening. Hope struggled to gather her bearings. She could hear her friends crying out for help, but the fire was too loud and the smoke too thick. She knew she had to move, to find a way out before the flames closed in on her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Hope crawled over the wreckage, trying to get to the emergency exit. But it was blocked. The bus had flipped on its side, and the way out was completely obstructed. Hope felt the heat press closer, the danger of the flames growing stronger by the second. She was dizzy, and her breath was shallow, but somehow she managed to push herself to the front of the bus. There, just as she was starting to lose hope, she heard the sounds of people outside. Shouts, sirens. The fire trucks had arrived. The rescue team was there. She couldn't see them, but she could hear their voices cutting through the chaos. Hope tried to call out, but her voice was weak, barely audible above the roar of the fire. "Lord, please help," she cried out, but no one seemed to hear. She coughed violently, trying to push herself further, but her vision was starting to blur, and her strength was failing. On the outside of the bus, the scene was horrific. The crash had drawn an immediate response, but even the experienced emergency responders were horrified by what they saw. The bus was twisted, the fire was spreading fast, and there were children still trapped inside. They worked as quickly as possible, but the damage was immense. The tanker explosion had caused more destruction than anyone could have imagined. As firefighters battled the flames, paramedics rushed to the wreckage, pulling children from the debris, their faces pale and their bodies covered in blood. Some were unconscious, others were crying out in pain, while others lay still, unresponsive. Liebert University and Marion Myers examined the data surrounding exercise. In the chaos, they didn't see Hope at first. She was lost among the wreckage, her body pinned and covered in smoke. But when they finally spotted her, she was barely clinging to life. Her clothes were singed, and her skin was covered in soot and ash. She was unconscious, but they could still detect a faint heartbeat. Hope's mother, Mrs. Alexander, was at home when the phone rang. It was the school. The voice on the other end was hurried and frantic, explaining the details of the crash. Mrs. Alexander's heart stopped as she listened, unable to comprehend the words at first. She heard accident, fire, multiple injuries, and then the worst word of all, fatalities. "Where are my daughters? Please, where are my daughters?" Mrs. Alexander pleaded, her voice breaking with fear. She could barely breathe as the terror sank in. The voice on the other end tried to calm her. "We're doing everything we can. The children are being transported to the hospital. Please, don't panic. Your daughters—" "Is Hope alive?" Mrs. Alexander interrupted, her voice desperate. "Please, tell me Hope is alive." The voice hesitated for a moment before responding. "Yes, Hope is alive. She's been taken to the hospital." Mrs. Alexander let out a sob of relief, but her heart was still heavy with dread. Her mind raced as she thought of her other daughters, Olivia and Hannah. What about them? She couldn't bring herself to ask the question she was most afraid of. At the hospital, chaos had already taken over. Doctors and nurses rushed from one room to another, trying to stabilize the many children who had been brought in after the crash. Some were unconscious, others barely clinging to life. But one thing was certain: the damage was severe. There had been too many injuries, too much destruction. Hope had been rushed into the emergency room, where doctors worked quickly to stabilize her. The shock and trauma of the crash had caused massive internal injuries, but against all odds, she was alive. Her survival was nothing short of a miracle. Her parents arrived at the hospital as quickly as they could, their hearts in their throats. Mrs. Alexander, still wearing her house slippers, rushed through the hallways, looking for any sign of her daughter. When she finally saw Hope, lying in the hospital bed with an oxygen mask over her face, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Hope, my sweet girl," Mrs. Alexander whispered, her voice trembling as she touched her daughter's hand. Hope didn't respond, but the faint pressure of her hand in her mother's was enough. She was still alive. But for how long? A doctor approached them, his expression somber. "Alexander, we're doing everything we can, but I need to tell you this. Your daughter was already gone when she arrived. We were able to revive her, but it was a miracle. She shouldn't have survived this iteration." Mrs. Alexander's heart sank. She had known the worst was possible, but hearing the doctor's words made it real. She wanted to scream, to shout, to demand an answer to why this had happened. But all she could do was hold her daughter's hand, praying for her to pull through. As the hours passed, Mrs. Alexander stayed by Hope's side, never leaving. Her heart was filled. Mrs. Alexander couldn't stop thinking about Olivia and Hannah. Her heart ached for them. She thought of how they had been laughing and excited just a day before. Now they were gone, lost in the flames of the crash. The fire had been too intense, the damage too severe. The thought that she would never see their smiling faces again felt unbearable. She blamed herself. "If only I had prayed more," she thought. "If only I had insisted they stay home. Maybe they would still be here." The guilt ate at her, and every time she looked at Hope, who lay motionless in the hospital bed, the pain grew deeper. She would never have imagined that Christmas, a time of joy, would become the darkest time of her life. Hope's recovery was slow. Every day she seemed to get a little stronger, but she remained in a haze, unaware of how much had changed. Her body was healing, but her mind was still trapped in a fog of confusion and grief. She had woken up once, only to be surrounded by doctors and her parents, their faces filled with concern. "Mom?" Hope had whispered weakly, her voice hoarse. "Where are Olivia and Hannah?" The question hit Mrs. Alexander like a punch to the gut. She had hoped that Hope wouldn't remember right away, that somehow the shock of the crash might shield her from the painful truth. But Hope's eyes were wide, her face filled with fear, and Mrs. Alexander couldn't lie. "They're gone, sweetie," she said softly, choking on the words. "Olivia and Hannah, they didn't make it. They..." Hope's eyes filled with tears and she turned away from her mother. It was as though the weight of the world had crashed down on her in an instant. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to accept it. She had lost her sisters, the ones who had been with her through everything, and now she was all alone. "I didn't want them to go," Hope whispered, her voice breaking. Mrs. Alexander knelt beside her daughter's bed, brushing the hair from her face. "I know, darling, I know, but you're not alone. We're here. We're going to get through this together." But Hope didn't seem to hear. She closed her eyes, retreating into herself, as though the weight of the tragedy was too much to bear. For the next several days, Hope remained distant. She barely spoke, and when she did, it was only in quiet, broken sentences. She refused to eat much, her body too exhausted to care for anything. Her parents tried to reach her, but she pushed them away. She didn't want to talk. She didn't want to face the reality of what had happened. Every time she looked at her mother, all she could see was her sadness, and it made her heart ache even more. Hope didn't want to hurt her mother, but she didn't know how to heal herself. As time passed, Mrs. Alexander's grief began to take its toll on her too. She spent hours sitting by Hope's bedside, watching her daughters slowly recover, but deep inside she was dying. The thought of Olivia and Hannah, the girls she had carried and raised, was overwhelming. Her heart felt like it was breaking in two. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Mrs. Alexander couldn't hold it in anymore. She found herself pacing around the hospital parking lot, her emotions swirling in a storm of anger, guilt, and sorrow. She had prayed. She had trusted. And yet, it felt as though her prayers had been unanswered. She cried out to God in desperation. "Why? Why them, Lord? Why my daughters? Why Olivia and Hannah? I don't understand. I don't know how to go on without them. Please, show me why." As she cried, she noticed something. The sky above her, though dark and heavy with clouds, seemed to be opening up. A small break in the clouds revealed a sliver of stars, distant, yet shining. For the first time since the crash, she felt a faint sense of peace. She wasn't sure why or how, but in that moment, she felt as though God had heard her, even if she didn't fully understand the answer. Hope's depression continued to deepen. The silence in their home was unbearable. Even when Hope was well enough to return home, her parents struggled to help her. Hope would often retreat to her room, refusing to come out for days at a time. Her once bright spirit had dimmed, and her eyes were empty, devoid of the joy she had once carried. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the weight of her grief crushed her. Her parents had tried everything to reach her. They had taken her to therapy, hoping to help her process the trauma and loss. But Hope resisted, refusing to talk, and the pain she was feeling only grew stronger. Mrs. Alexander had even caught her daughter slicing her arm with a broken piece of glass. Hope had passed out from the pain, and when her parents found her, they rushed her to the hospital once again. The doctors were horrified, but they were also understanding. Hope had been so broken by the loss of her sisters that she had tried to escape the pain in the only way she knew how. Mrs. Alexander was devastated. This was a different kind of grief, one that didn't just hurt the heart, but also the soul. The guilt and sorrow she felt for not knowing what was happening to her daughter ate away at her. Mrs. Alexander sat beside Hope's bed, holding her daughter's hand gently, praying silently. She knew that it was only through faith that they would ever make it through this. Even if the pain never fully went away, she knew that God was with them. And that knowledge, small as it was, began to give her hope. The weeks that followed were a mixture of quiet moments and long, painful hours. Hope's physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars were deep, and the journey back to herself was slow. Each day felt like a battle, one that she didn't know how to fight. The weight of the crash, of losing her sisters, still hung heavily on her heart. She had moments when she wanted to scream, when she wanted to run away from the pain that seemed endless. But there was one thing that kept her tethered to this world, and it was her mother's unwavering love. "I may miss you too." Mrs. Alexander refused to give up. Every day, she sat by Hope's side, speaking softly, reminding her of the love and strength within her. Sometimes Hope would listen, but most days, she remained silent, looking out the window or staring at the walls, lost in her thoughts. One night, as Mrs. Alexander sat beside Hope's bed, she felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. She had prayed every night since the crash, asking God for the strength to carry her family through this. She had spent countless hours grieving, but now, she was coming to understand something. The pain wasn't something she could run from. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple prayer or a few comforting words, but there was still hope. There was still a chance for healing. As she sat in the dimly lit room, she noticed Hope staring at her. It was the first time Hope had truly looked at her in weeks, and in that moment, a flicker of recognition passed between them. Hope's eyes were no longer empty. There was a small spark of something like life. Hope opened her mouth, her voice still fragile, but there was a strength in it that hadn't been there before. "Mom, I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix this," Hope whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Alexander's heart broke for her daughter, but she smiled, her tears falling silently. "There's nothing to fix, sweetie. We don't have to have all the answers. We're just going to keep going, step by step, together." Hope's hand tightened around her mother's, a small but powerful gesture. It was as though Hope was slowly starting to come back, piece by piece. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how to heal, but she was willing to try, and that was enough.